They told us the Veth'Kai had never lost a siege. Not once. Not in 400 years of expansion across 17 star systems. Their war doctrine was elegant in its brutality: arrive in overwhelming force, hold high orbit, and simply wait. Wait while the atmosphere processors failed. Wait while the water recyclers choked on mineral dust. Wait while the lights flickered out one colony at a time, until the people below had nothing left to bargain with except their surrender. 17 systems, hundreds of worlds, millions of souls who had looked up at those cathedral-shaped warships hanging in their skies and decided that survival was worth more than pride. We were supposed to be number 18. Kepler's reach was not a glamorous colony. Nobody had ever written poems about it. The tourism boards, back when such things existed, had described it as industrially significant, which was bureaucratic language for bleak, cold, and thoroughly unglamorous. The planet's surface was a patchwork of open-pit mines carved into violet-tinged rock, processing facilities wrapped in steam, and prefabricated habitat modules bolted together over 3 generations into something that almost resembled a city. The sky was the color of an old bruise. The wind tasted like iron filings and regret. But 600 meters beneath that bruised sky, running in seams thick as city blocks, was the richest deposit of refined trilithium ore in the explored galaxy. Trilithium, the material that made faster-than-light transit possible, the material that every starfaring civilization in the known universe needed the way a human body needs blood. Without Kepler's reach, half the trade lanes in this arm of the galaxy would wither and die within a generation. That was why the Veth'Kai came. 9 warships, cathedral class, every one of them, vessels so massive they created their own gravitational microfields, so heavily armored that standard military kinetic rounds shed off their hulls like water off stone. They dropped out of fold space on a Tuesday morning local time, and within 6 hours they had established a complete orbital blockade. No ships in, no ships out, no communications beyond the tight beam ultimatum. They beamed directly to the colony administrator's personal terminal. Surrender the mining rights. Accept the Veth'Kai Compact's authority. Or wait. Administrator Yeva Marchetti read the message 3 times. She was 61 years old, born in the tunnels of Kepler's reach to parents who had been born in those same tunnels. She had spent her career keeping 16,000 miners, engineers, and their families alive on a planet that tried to kill you in 17 different ways before breakfast. She had negotiated labor disputes that made Veth'Kai warships look straightforward by comparison. She had a reputation for being the charitable version methodical. The less charitable version used other words. She read the message a 4th time. Then she called a meeting, not with her Security Council, not with the colony's nominal defense attaché, a young lieutenant named Osai who had been posted to Kepler's reach, because someone in the fleet had decided it was a quiet posting, and he needed seasoning. She called a meeting with her engineers. Chief among them was a woman named Dara Vasquez Hole. Dara was the kind of person that institutions produce occasionally, and almost never know what to do with: a mining engineer who had spent 30 years thinking about the problem of moving extremely large, extremely dense objects across extremely large distances in extremely short amounts of time. That was, stripped of context, exactly what a mass driver did. The colony had 3 of them. They were called extraction launchers in the official documentation, rail-assisted orbital delivery platforms in the Union contracts. The miners called them the hammers because miners have a gift for accurate language. Each hammer was designed to take a 100-ton ore canister and accelerate it from the planet's surface to a transfer orbit in approximately 4 seconds. They were not weapons. The documentation was very clear on this point. They were industrial equipment. The safety protocols surrounding their operation were extensive, carefully maintained, and Dara had been noting for the better part of a decade, almost entirely focused on preventing accidents rather than preventing intentional use. The distinction mattered. When Yeva laid out the situation to her engineering team in the rock-carved command center, the holographic displays showing 9 orange threat markers in a neat orbital ring, the Veth'Kai warships like cathedral spires hanging over the world, there was silence for a long moment. Then Dara Vasquez Holt uncapped her stylus and said, simply, "Run me through what we have." What they had was this: 3 operational mass drivers, each capable of launching a 100-ton payload to orbital velocity. A stockpile of 47 ore canisters already loaded, sealed, and staged for a launch sequence that had been scheduled before the Veth'Kai arrived. A targeting computer that was, strictly speaking, designed to calculate transfer orbits to the processing station in high orbit, but which could, with modifications, calculate any orbital trajectory to any point in space above the planet. A team of people who had spent their entire professional lives thinking about ballistics, trajectories, material densities, and impact physics. And time because the Veth'Kai were patient. They were always patient. That was the doctrine. Sit. Wait. Let the colony die slowly. No need to spend the energy on bombardment when entropy would do the work for you. They gave Kepler's reach 72 hours to consider the ultimatum. They did not know that 72 hours was approximately 71 hours more than Dara Vasquez Holt needed to run the numbers. Here is the problem with fighting a warship in orbit. The warship's designers had thought very carefully about every threat that might approach it from space, from other warships, from missiles, from directed energy weapons, from the entire conventional vocabulary of space combat. They had armored accordingly. The Veth'Kai cathedral-class vessels were engineering masterpieces, wrapped in layered reactive plating, equipped with point defense grids that could track and destroy incoming ordnance moving at up to 11 kilometers per second. 11 kilometers per second. That number appears in the Veth'Kai defense doctrine as the upper threshold of their point defense engagement envelope. It is a remarkable achievement of engineering. It represented, at the time of the doctrine's writing, the maximum feasible velocity of any weapon system a hostile force might plausibly bring to bear in a planetary engagement. The Veth'Kai had never, in 400 years of conquest, encountered a planetary mass driver. The ore canisters leaving Hammer 3 left the launch rail at 14 kilometers per second. They were not the problem. The problem was the math, or rather, the solution to it. Because at 14 kilometers per second, a 100-ton canister of compressed trilithium ore does not need to be aimed with the precision of a guided missile. It needs to be aimed with the precision of a pool shot, bounced off the geometry of orbital mechanics, allowed to coast, allowed to fall, the trajectory curving through the gravity well in a long, patient arc that the targeting computer could calculate to within 3 meters of tolerance at a range of 400 kilometers. Dara explained this to Yeva over cold coffee at 2 in the morning colony time. The administrator listened without expression. When Dara finished, Yeva was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many shots?" Dara said, "Depends on what you're trying to accomplish." Yeva said, "I'm trying to survive." Dara looked at her screen, at the 9 orange markers in their neat orbital ring, at the 47 canisters staged and ready, at 30 years of calculations, crystallized into a single, clear, terrible answer. She said, "Then we don't aim for the ships," and she explained the rest of it. The Veth'Kai orbital blockade was precise and total. 9 ships positioned at calculated intervals to create overlapping sensor coverage, to prevent any vessel from slipping through the net. It was elegant. It was practiced. It had never needed to account for the fact that ore canisters launched on a transfer trajectory look to a sensor system calibrated to detect incoming weapons fire, almost exactly like regularly scheduled mining output. Because they were. The first 17 launches were legitimate, ore canisters, right on the pre-existing schedule that the Veth'Kai had captured in the colony's commercial records when they arrived. The automated systems logged them as routine industrial activity. The Veth'Kai warships tracked them, identified them as commercial cargo, and filed them in the low-priority sensor queue where they sat unexamined, coasting toward the processing station on their calculated trajectories. At hour 61 of the 72-hour ultimatum window, Dara Vasquez Holt sat down at the modified targeting console and personally calculated a new set of trajectories. Not to the processing station, not to any stable transfer orbit, to a series of very precise points in space that happened to coincide with the gap between the first and second Veth'Kai warships in the orbital ring. Not the ships themselves. The gap. She launched 6 canisters in a staggered sequence over 4 hours. They coasted outbound in the sensor shadow of the legitimate ore traffic, hidden in the clutter of 17 previous launches that the Veth'Kai had already classified as benign. They were traveling at 14 kilometers per second, 3 kilometers per second beyond the point defense engagement threshold, by the time they left the planet's upper atmosphere. The Veth'Kai didn't see them, or rather, and this is the part that the military analysts would argue about for years afterward, they saw them. The data was there in the sensor logs. 6 contacts, classified as commercial cargo, logged as routine. The automated systems looked at them and saw exactly what they had been designed to see. Ore canisters, on a standard transfer trajectory, doing exactly what ore canisters do. The human mind, presented with the same data, might have caught the anomaly. The Veth'Kai automated systems did not, because the Veth'Kai had never needed to worry about industrial equipment being used as a weapon, because the Veth'Kai had never met a civilization that was crazy enough, or desperate enough, or creative enough to try it. 6 canisters, 6 trajectories, all of them curving, patient, falling through the gravity well on their long arcs toward the gap in the orbital ring. They did not hit the warships. They hit the space between the first and second ships at intervals of approximately 40 seconds. 6 sequential impacts, each one a 100-ton mass moving at 14 kilometers per second, detonating in the sensor-dense space between 2 of the 9 warships in the orbital ring. The kinetic energy release of a single impact was equivalent to approximately 240 megatons. 6 of them, spaced 40 seconds apart in a gap 40 kilometers wide, created what the subsequent after-action reports would describe as a cascading electromagnetic disruption event. The shrapnel field from the first impact was still expanding when the second arrived. The sensor arrays on both adjacent warships, which had been tuned to the precise frequency needed to maintain the blockade's coverage, were overwhelmed by the electromagnetic pulse of the first detonation before their operators could process what was happening. By the third detonation, the gap in the orbital ring was a 30-kilometer sphere of expanding debris, ionized gas, and electromagnetic chaos that no sensor system in the Veth'Kai fleet could see through. The blockade had a hole in it, not a ship-sized hole. The Veth'Kai could close a ship-sized hole. What they couldn't close, not quickly, not without moving their vessels out of their carefully calculated positions and breaking the sensor coverage pattern on the other 8 sides of the ring, was a hole created by 6 simultaneous sensor blinding events in the same quadrant of the orbital sphere. They tried to close it anyway. That was doctrine. Maintain the ring. Fill the gap. The two warships flanking the disruption zone began to move. Lieutenant Osai, the young fleet attaché who had been posted to Kepler's reach because someone thought it was a quiet posting, had spent the 61 hours since the Veth'Kai arrived doing two things. First, getting absolutely no sleep. Second, on Yeva's authorization, sending a series of tight beam communications on a frequency that the Veth'Kai blockade was not monitoring, because it was calibrated to the operating frequency of the colony's geological survey drones, which no military communication system in the galaxy would bother to jam. He had been very specifically requesting a patrol corvette. One ship, not a battle group, not a rescue fleet. One small, fast, heavily modified patrol corvette named the Perseverance, currently assigned to a survey run 3 light towers away, whose captain had listened to Osai's explanation and said, in a tone of voice that suggested she was reconsidering her career choices, that she was on her way. The Perseverance arrived at the edge of the Kepler's reach gravity well at hour 61 and 47 minutes, which was 11 minutes after the 6th ore canister hit the gap in the Veth'Kai orbital ring. The hole was open. The captain of the Perseverance, a woman named Sable Oren, who had spent 15 years flying patrol routes nobody else wanted and had developed, in that time, a very specific skill set centered on going very fast through very small spaces, looked at the tactical display. She looked at the 30-kilometer sphere of electromagnetic chaos in the Veth'Kai orbital ring. She looked at the 2 Cathedral-class warships moving to close it. She looked at the distance between them and the closing rate and the window that implied. She said, "Strap in." The Perseverance went a full military thrust and dove for the hole. It was not a comfortable transit. The Perseverance was a lean ship, designed for speed and sensor range rather than firepower, and the expanding debris field from 6 simultaneous 100-ton impacts was not a clean environment to fly through at emergency acceleration. The electromagnetic disruption played havoc with her navigation systems. Captain Oren flew it by sight and instinct and 15 years of experience threading needles in bad weather, and she came through the gap with 17 seconds to spare before the 2 Veth'Kai warships would have closed it. The Perseverance came through the hole in the blockade doing 19 kilometers per second and decelerating hard, burning retrograde to shed velocity before she hit the upper atmosphere, broadcasting on every frequency she had. Emergency, colony under siege, requesting immediate response, transmitting full tactical data. The tactical data included everything: the position of all 9 Veth'Kai warships, the hole in the sensor ring and exactly how it had been created, the specific electromagnetic frequencies that the ore canister impacts had disrupted, and the recovery timeline Dara's team had calculated for the Veth'Kai sensor arrays. Everything a responding fleet would need to know. She had 16 hours before the Veth'Kai ultimatum expired. She needed to be 3 light towers away, broadcasting on a frequency that would reach a listening post, and she needed whoever was at that listening post to take her seriously. She was, it turned out, very easy to take seriously. The tactical data was the kind of data that military analysts look at once and then look at again with their mouths open. Not because of what it showed about the Veth'Kai, though that was valuable. Because of what it showed about what 16,000 miners and 1 overworked fleet attaché had done with 3 industrial mass drivers and 47 ore canisters in 61 hours. The response fleet that arrived at Kepler's reach 14 hours and 20 minutes later was not, strictly speaking, there to fight. The Veth'Kai doctrine did not account for a fight. The doctrine said, hold the blockade, wait for surrender, accept the terms. The doctrine had worked for 400 years. The doctrine had never before encountered a situation where the fleet arrived to find the blockade already compromised. the tactical data already transmitted to the enemy's high command, and a 17-minute window of electromagnetic chaos in the orbital ring that had created the precise intelligence picture needed to plan a counter-blockade operation. The Veth'Kai fleet commander looked at the approaching human response fleet. He looked at the hole in his orbital ring, still partially disrupted, the sensor arrays in that quadrant still rebuilding coverage. He looked at the tactical data that his own intelligence service was confirming had already been transmitted. The data that meant there was no longer any advantage to holding the blockade, because the element of information control that the siege doctrine depended on was gone. He looked at the 41 remaining ore canisters still staged on the surface of Kepler's reach, and at the modified targeting data that his signals team had recovered from the colony's transmissions, and at the very clear mathematical picture this created. Then he looked at his orders. His orders said to hold. Doctrine said to hold. 400 years of unbroken success said to hold. He held for 6 more hours. It was, in hindsight, not his finest decision. 3 more canisters came through the partially restored sensor coverage in that time, not aimed at the gap this time, aimed at the processing station that sat in high orbit, a piece of Veth'Kai-controlled infrastructure that his fleet commander's instinct had told him to occupy in the first hours of the blockade, because controlling the processing station meant controlling the value of the ore. The processing station was not a warship. It had no point defense. The canisters hit it at 14 kilometers per second, and the math did what the math always does. He broke the blockade 4 minutes later. The doctrine, later amended, would include a new operational category, industrial hazard environments, a set of recommendations around planetary mass drivers, their effective range, their engagement envelope, their potential for use as improvised weapon systems by a defending population. The category would be added to the Veth'Kai military planning database as a footnote, in the section covering unusual threats. The footnote would reference Kepler's reach. In the colony itself, the moment the Veth'Kai warships broke orbit was not the dramatic, cinematic moment that the history books would later describe. It was, as most actual moments of victory tend to be, exhausting and quiet and a little anticlimactic. The warships just moved. The orange markers on the holographic display shifted, first 1, then 2, then in clusters, moving outward from their orbital positions, accelerating away from the planet, some of them already beginning the fold space calculations that would take them out of the system entirely. The miners in the command center watched it happen in silence. Then someone, nobody could ever agree afterward on who it was, started laughing. And then someone else joined in. And then it wasn't laughing exactly. It was the particular sound that humans make when the thing they were afraid of is receding, when the held breath can finally be released, when 16,000 people who had spent 72 hours not thinking about what would happen if this didn't work suddenly thought about it all at once and felt the weight of it leaving. Yeva Marchetti watched the last orange marker move off the display. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at the now empty orbital ring for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Get me Dara." Dara Vasquez Holt was in the Hammer 3 control room, still running numbers on trajectories that were no longer necessary. She looked up when Yeva came in. She looked at Yeva's face and understood immediately. She said, "They're gone." Yeva said, "They're gone." Dara looked back at her screens, at the numbers, at 30 years of work with industrial equipment, that the documentation was very clear, was not a weapon. She said, "Good, I've got ore to ship." The Perseverance came back 36 hours later. Captain Sable Oren walked off her ship and into the colony's receiving bay with the specific walk of a person who has been awake for much too long and has processed exactly nothing of what just happened. Lieutenant Osai met her at the dock. He looked equally wrecked. They looked at each other. He said, "How was the flight out?" She said, "Eventful. You?" He said, "Quiet mostly. After the exciting part." She said, "The exciting part was the mass drivers." He said, "The mass drivers were the exciting part, yes." She said, "I watched the impact data on the transit. 100 tons at 14 clicks per second." He said, "6 of them." She said, "6. In the sensor gap." He said, 40 seconds apart. She said, I've been doing fleet operations for 15 years and I've never seen anything like." He said, "Nobody has. That's kind of the thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who calculated the trajectories?" He said, "Mining engineer named Vasquez Hole. She's been here 30 years." She said, "I want to meet her." He said, "She's probably back at work." She mentioned something about a shipping backlog, which was true. The ore didn't move itself. The processing station was compromised, which meant a revised logistics plan, which meant new trajectories, which meant Dara was at her console running calculations. The fact that the same calculations had, 72 hours ago, been adjusted to send those canisters into the gap in a Veth'Kai orbital blockade was a detail that Dara filed as she always filed such details. Noted, recorded, and set aside in favor of the work that was actually in front of her. She was that kind of person. Kepler's reach made the news feeds, eventually. The story was told in a dozen different ways by a dozen different outlets, and the version that survived into the popular consciousness was the simplest one. Miners fight off alien siege with industrial equipment, which was true as far as it went. It left out the math, the 30 years of trajectory calculations, the modified targeting software, the 61 hours of sleepless planning in a rock-carved command center. It left out the 17 faint launches that built the pattern of routine behavior the Veth'Kai sensors had come to rely on. It left out Yeva Marchetti's question, not how do we fight, but how do we survive, and the specific difference in thinking that created. But the version that mattered, the version that spread through the Veth'Kai military planning structure and sat in their amended doctrine as a footnote, was accurate in every particular. It said, the colony at Kepler's reach used 3 industrial mass drivers to create a sensor disruption event sufficient to compromise a 9-ship orbital blockade, transmit tactical data to a responding fleet, and destroy a high-value orbital asset, using equipment not classified as military hardware. It said, recommend additional review of mass driver capabilities in all planetary industrial contexts before initiating siege operations. It said, this incident represents the first successful defense against a cathedral-class orbital blockade in 400 years of doctrine. The last line, added by an analyst whose name was never recorded, said simply, the humans did not have weapons. They had tools. The distinction appears to have been less meaningful than anticipated. In the history of first contacts, second contacts, and the long, complicated story of humanity finding its place in a galaxy that had largely decided, before humanity arrived, what roles the various civilizations were supposed to play, the story of Kepler's reach held a specific place. Not the largest battle, not the most casualties, not the most dramatic moment by any conventional military measure, but the moment that something changed, not in what humans could do. Humans had always been able to do the math. Not in what humans were willing to do. Humanity had always been willing to improvise, to adapt, to look at the tool that was in front of them, and ask the question that the tool's designers had not anticipated. The moment that the galaxy learned to ask a different question about the species that had arrived, unannounced and somewhat undersized, in the outer spiral arm of a fairly ordinary galaxy. Not what are they armed with, but what do they have? Because the answer, as Kepler's reach demonstrated, was always more complicated than it looked. The Veth'Kai had 9 cathedral-class warships and 400 years of unbroken doctrine, and the patience of a civilization that had never needed to rush. The humans had 3 mass drivers, 47 ore canisters, and Dara Vasquez Hole. The ore canisters won, not because the humans were stronger, not because they had better weapons, not because some cavalry arrived at the last moment and turned the tide through superior firepower. Because 61 hours into a 72-hour ultimatum, a mining engineer sat down at a targeting console and asked a simple question that nobody in 400 years of Veth'Kai conquest had ever had occasion to ask. What happens when a 100-ton mass, moving at 14 kilometers per second, hits the gap between 2 warships in a sensor-optimized orbital ring? She already knew the answer. She had been calculating the trajectories for 30 years. The Veth'Kai retreated into deep space, trailing debris and questions. The questions would take them longer to answer than the repairs. They would study Kepler's reach. They would adjust their doctrine. They would add the footnotes and the reviewed categories and the new threat assessments. They would look at every industrial installation in every contested system with new eyes, calculating distances and payloads and impact energies, trying to anticipate the thing that humans seem to do instinctively, the pivot, the improvisation, the unexpected angle. They would never quite manage to anticipate it. Because the thing about improvisation is that it doesn't come from a doctrine. It doesn't come from a training manual or a threat assessment matrix or a 400-year tradition of elegant, practiced siege warfare. It comes from people. Specific people in specific situations, with specific problems, and the specific mad determination to solve them with whatever happens to be at hand. Kepler's reach went back to work. The ore moved. The hammers launched. The bruised violet sky turned orange at the edges at the end of each shift, the light catching the steam from the processing facilities, and the colony that had never been glamorous and never been celebrated and never been anything except industrially significant continued to be exactly what it had always been. Alive. 16,000 people, in the tunnels and the modules and the rock-carved rooms of a cold, iron-tasting planet, going about the business of survival the way they had always done it, one shift at a time, one problem at a time, one calculation at a time. And in a small office carved from the rock 40 meters below the surface of Kepler's reach, Dara Vasquez Holt sat at her console and ran her trajectories and drank cold coffee, and did not think of herself as a hero or a weapon or a symbol of anything in particular. She thought about the ore, about the backlog, about the revised logistics routing now that the processing station needed repairs, about the new canister specifications that might improve launch efficiency by 3% if the tolerances held. She thought about the work, which was, perhaps, the most human thing of all.